Hey everyone, thanks for listening to Barbarous Words. I'm Aequus Nox, and today I'm really excited because my guest is Tom McArthur. Tom did a presentation on the PGM that I watched on YouTube, which is a really good introduction to working with the text, so I will leave a link to that below if you want to check it out. Tom is a classicist witch who belongs to a Gardnerian coven and has a syncretic personal practice which is influenced by the PGM. So I thought it would be really cool if I invited him on for an interview today so that we could talk more about that. Thanks so much for being here today. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Tom. I'm a witch, an occultist. I practice a variety of different things. So my sort of religious vocation is Wicca. I'm a Gardnerian Wiccan. And outside of that, in my personal practice, I work heavily with the Greek Magical Papyri. I'm also exploring other things at the moment, like Goetia and the Grimoire tradition, and getting to grips with that. I came to the Greek Magical Papyri through academic study originally. I did my undergraduate dissertation on it at university as I wanted to do something to do with magic, and I came across the papyri and they were amazing. And I spent a year or so diving deep into those. And as a practitioner, I sort of then started developing a magical practice out of them as well. And so I've got this sort of perspective both as sort of a classicist and a sort of more of an academic approach, and a practitioner as well. And I bring, and it's I love the PGM for that reason, because it brings together my love of the classics and the ancient world as a historian and my love of magic as a practitioner, and I get to bring the two together here. So it's a nerd's dream, basically. So that's me. I'm an ancient history nerd and a magical practitioner.
Well, I love it because I am also both of those things, not so much of the scholarly approach, but definitely an ancient history nerd. So, for those who don't know, what is the PGM?
So the PGM stands for Papyri Graecae Magicae. It's the Latin name for the Greek Magical Papyri. And we just use PGM because it's shorter, basically. It's the referencing system used. So the Greek Magical Papyri are a collection of papyri, written in Greek, so spells written in Greek on papyrus, that's date from roughly the 2nd century BC through to the 5th century AD. And most of the texts fall towards the end of that period, sort of 3rd, 4th, 5th century AD. And the collection as we have it today was not put together by occultists. This is not something that was put together in the ancient world. Rather, various sort of scraps of magical papyrus were brought together and collected by a German scholar in the 19th century called Preisendanz. And he put together this, maybe the early 20th century, and he put this together and published a copy of the Greek with German translations. And then later on in the 1980s, a guy called Hans Dieter Betz produced an English translation. Papyri are not just Greek. There's also, it's written in Coptic and Demotic being the main language on there. Demotic was an Egyptian language, which originally was one of the sort of the more commonly used Egyptian sort of written languages. And then by the end of the sort of the papyri period, so by the end of the 5th century AD, Demotic was no longer in use by your average person. It was the preserve of the sort of Egyptian temple priests. So we know, and that allows us to have an idea of who might have worked with these texts, because there were certainly practical magicians. They were people who were doing magic often for hire. And we think because of the Demotic on many of these papyri and the fact that many of them are bilingual, so you have Greek and Demotic, that these practitioners may well have been priests whose either their temples have been shut down, because of course this is the time when Christianity was on the rise, or the Egyptian priests would often, in their heyday, would spend sort of X number of months a year at the temple, and then the other months they'd have off. And to make money in that time, they would do magic, kind of as a sort of a way to keep making money. So certainly some of these magicians were priests. Not all of them were. We can't say for certain who any of them were. We can certainly guess that some of them would have been priests. It seems a fairly reasonable assumption that most scholars can agree on. So the Greek Magical Papyri are a collection of everything, of all sorts of magical texts that we have from a certain time period. And so from the 2nd century BC to the 5th century AD. They don't represent a complete system of magic. Rather, they are the working notes of magicians who were working at that time. So if you were to pick up the papyri today and have a look, and it wouldn't say sort of, step 1 do this, step 2 do that. It's rather just a collection of notes which today's magicians have to try and create their own system from. You can extrapolate a lot out of them, and there are some spells which you can do as read, but a lot of them you need to adapt. It's a wealth of resources of a really interesting phase in sort of the development of Western magic, and it's and these papyri have had a huge influence on later texts. And when reading the papyri, you can see the influence these ideas have had on the later grimoires, and in turn they influence the likes of Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn, and so much of the magic that comes today as well. So these are hugely influential texts, and they are absolutely fascinating. Some of it, you've got some of the most absolutely brilliant magic in there, doing all sorts of very interesting things. You also have some very strange, silly stuff as well, because these are the writings that all the writings on magic from a certain time period in a certain place. So some of it's great, some of it's terrible, and it's quite fun to sort of sort through between and see what's worth working with and what isn't. They are a fascinating corpus that I would encourage anybody to have a go with.
Yeah, no, I definitely have found them to be incredibly fascinating. In fact, that's probably one of the most consistent things that I have found in a lot of the work that I've been interested in. So I guess my next question for you is, like, who are the spirits in the PGM?
So spirits in the PGM are, it's a difficult question to answer, because certainly from a scholarly perspective, looking at them, there's no clear agreement between the spells. So you encounter all sorts of different entities. You have, and you'll see often the same word used to sort of interchangeably to describe different beings. So, for example, you'll see the word angelos or angel crop up quite a lot. And the important thing to remember when looking at this word is that it doesn't refer to necessarily to what we would conceive of as an angel today, because the sort of the celestial hierarchies of that informed sort of the grimoire picture of angels had not been established at this point. The angels in the Greek Magical Papyri are, well, angelos is more of a description of a role, because it means messenger in Greek, and anybody, anything could potentially be referred to as an angelos. You'll see St. Paul being referred to as an angelos in various texts around that time. It's more of a title rather than a name of a specific being. And so, for example, there's in many spells you'll see angelos and theos used fairly interchangeably, so angel and god. And it's more about talking about the role that the entity fills. You'll also see the word daimon popping up a lot, plural daimones. Now, a daimon is, the word daimon is very, very complex. And various different sort of, there's a difference between sort of how the philosophers viewed daimons and how sort of your average sort of practitioner or magician might have viewed them. So on the easiest way to understand what a daimon is simply to understand it as a spirit, and just sort of leave it at that. If you want to get a bit more complicated, then within Platonic doctrine, there's this idea that the daimons are the intermediaries between the gods and man, and this idea that the gods, being perfect and divine, cannot interact with the impure sort of mortal physical world. You have to have the daimons, which partake of both worlds, and they so go between the gods and man. And so Platonists such as Plutarch and Iamblichus explained much of sort of magical phenomenon in terms of sort of the interaction of daimons. And they're not evil beings, they're simply beings that exist sort of between gods and man. But within the papyri, you see that that's clearly not the only understanding going on, because you also get sort of older associations of them as simply sort of just general spirits. And you'll see good daimons and evil daimons, and sort of ideas about them which clearly are sort of like Platonic as well. And I think the one thing that you can safely say for any of the spirits in the PGM is that the words, the things they're called, what they are called, the terms applied to them, are not your best guide for what they actually are. The first best way to find out what a spirit is to conjure them. The sort of failing that, if one wants to take a purely academic approach, then I tend to favour looking at what way the spell actually works and the way you're trying to interact with them. So how the magician relates to the spirit. If you're trying to understand sort of where these sort of different ideas have cross-fertilized, then looking at the technology of how the spell works and how the magician relates to the entity once they've called it gives you a far better idea of what that entity might be. Because these magicians who are copying these spells, many of them wouldn't have known too much about the spell or how it actually worked. They may not have been familiar with the sort of the theory behind it. So every magician working with these spells would have had probably slightly different understandings of who these entities were. It would have come down to the relationship and the experience they had of conjuring them. And I think these labels that we apply to spirits aren't very helpful, because if you get caught up in, are they a demon, are they an angel, it distracts from, well, actually, who are they? Sort of conjure them and find out, or work with them, see who they are. And so in answer to the question, who are the spirits in the PGM, I would say I wouldn't want to speak for them. They are gods, angels, demons, all of those, and none of those. And the best way to get a handle on who they might be is to start working with them and see how they appear to you.
Well, I love that advice. That is actually amazing advice, and I think that it'll be refreshing for a lot of people to hear. One of the spirits in particular that I guess is interesting to me is the Paradros. So what is the Paradros, and what do you do with it?
So the Paradros is an entity that one finds in the Greek Magical Papyri. It's fairly unique to the PGM. You don't really see the term used in this way anywhere else, although it's an older Greek term. And the Paradros, the word Paradros literally means the one who sits beside, so sitting beside. And most scholars, myself included, tend to translate it as assistant. It's sort of an assistant spirit. It's I've seen it compared to sort of the familiar spirit of sort of medieval witchcraft, and that's slightly anachronistic, but it gets to the heart of this idea that it's a spirit entity that assists the magician. And you see various entities called a Paradros. You will see it referred to, sometimes spirits of the dead are referred to as paradroi, that's the plural. Sometimes it's the god Eros, it's the god of love. But there are 10 spells that sort of make use of this term Paradros. And what I found when studying the Paradros was that because full disclaimer here, this is something that I've done academic study of, but I've yet to conjure a Paradros myself. So I'm talking purely from a scholarly perspective here. There are various different kinds of Paradros that one can find, and the two that I've looked at in particular is what I call the externalized Paradros, the Paradros that remains separate entirely to the magician. And then there's another kind of Paradros, what I call an internalized Paradros, and these are in the spells where the magician actually and the Paradros seem to almost become one, and there seems to be some sort of mystical union between the Paradros and the magician. So, for example, there are some spells where there's one spell where the daimons of the spirit Typhon, the god Typhon, the god of chaos, are evoked as the assistants, but they are not the magician's assistants. They are paradroi of Typhon, and the magician's just calling on them for aid. And in that spell, the magician and the spirits, they're very much kept separate. There's no sort of point of unity between them. However, there is a spell in the first papyrus in the collection. There are 2 spells for conjuring paradroi, where it's actually more of a sort of spiritual relationship between the magician and this entity. And the most interesting of these is PGM 140, PGM 1, so that's Papyrus 1, 42 to 195, that's the line reference. And I'm just going to get that out now, and I'll read you a little bit of that spell and talk you through sort of what's going on there. The Paradros in this spell functions effectively as an explanation for the miraculous powers that might be ascribed to a magician in this time. So it said that if you conjure the Paradros, you will be able to you'll be able to sort of perceive the future, but it's the Paradros who perceives the future, and you'll ask the Paradros what's going to happen in the future. And it says in the spell that to everyone looking on, it will look as if you're making the prediction, but you secretly, you'll in your own vision be able to see the Paradros, and actually they're the one giving you the information. It also gives the power to, for example, I don't know, freeze the sea, create miraculous feasts out of nothing, bring wealth, control the weather, strike down your enemies, bring lovers to you. All the sort of miraculous powers that ancient magicians were thought to have, they're all explained in this spell by the magician having this entity, having this Paradros, this assistant. And so it's sort of almost understood that the magician does not have any magical powers of their own, but rather they are gained by sort of by the work of the Paradros. So there's a lot going on in the spell, but I think it's quite a good spell because it demonstrates a lot of the sort of common features of the magic in the papyri. So in order to do the spell, the first thing you have to do is you have to go through a period of purification, where you abstain from animal food and all uncleanliness, so sort of sexual contact, that kind of thing. And this call for ritual purity is something that you'll see a lot throughout the papyri spells. And this spell doesn't specify how long you're supposed to be do it for, but some spells suggest 3 days, for example, much like in the True Grimoire. But there's this whole idea of sort of being pure before you go to do this work, and that's a sort of definite influence on the grimoires. The ingredients that you use in the spell are of all planetary associations. So this spell is done. You camp out on your roof because obviously in sort of the Mediterranean at that time, as today, a lot of people would sleep on their roofs and they'd have flat roofs, and that was the space recommended for doing the sort of the magic. And you stay out there overnight. And you start as the sun sets, and then you stay out there overnight, and then do the next bit of the working as the sun rises. And you get various ingredients called upon. So they use frankincense and heliotrope for their solar associations, and you get myrrh and myrtle used for the lunar part of the working. And what's interesting here is these plants that are associated with the sun and moon respectively in magic today. And so what I found really interesting with studying this spell is that you can see that these correspondences we have for planetary magic today date back over 2,000 years, that these are associations that have been around for a very, very long time. It's not something the Golden Dawn just pulled out of nowhere, or Agrippa for that matter. So you go up onto the roof and you do various things. What happens is there's a falcon that flies down and stands in front of you, and after flapping its wings in midair and dropping an oblong stone, it will immediately take flight and ascend to heaven. You should pick up this stone, carve it at once, and engrave it later. Once it has been engraved, bore a hole in it, pass a thread through, and wear it around your neck. So what's happening here, this is the creation of a sort of a phylactery. And a phylactery is a protective charm that one wears when performing this magic. It's to protect you from the gods and spirits you're conjuring, because there's very much an understanding that this magic was risky and that the gods and spirits may not have your best interests at heart. And many spells call for the creation of a specific phylactery that is related to sort of the powers concerned. And so it also seems to sort of align the magician with the work they're doing as well as protecting them. Other spells don't make mention of a phylactery, and it seems reasonable to assume that there would be a general phylactery that one might wear for most spells, and indeed there is instructions for creating one of those in the PGM as a general phylactery that one can wear for spells that do not specify a particular one. The Falcon delivery service is quite unique to this spell, and I'm very excited. This is a spell that I would like at some point to try and reconstruct for modern use, and I need to. When doing so, I need to try and figure out whether Falcon Delivery Service is meant to be a literal thing or a visual thing, and I don't know. I will get back to you once I have tried the spell. And after you've sort of gone through this process, the spirit appears to you, and there is a strong sort of there is a vision that is described in quite a lot of detail of what's supposed to happen. And this is not unusual. Often the vision will be described in great detail. And it goes like this. Once there'll be a sign for you like this. A blazing star will descend and come to a stop in the middle of the housetop. And when the stars dissolve before your eyes, you will behold the angel whom you have summoned and who has been sent to you. And you will quickly learn the decisions of the gods. But do not be afraid. Approach the god and take his right hand. Kiss him and say these words to the angel. So I'll stop there, and you can see there, that's an example of what I was talking about, where the words angel and God are used interchangeably. And if you get too hung up on, well, gods and angels, they're different, you're going to miss the point of the spell, insofar as it's not about necessarily what it's called, it's about the relationship you are going to form with this being. And sort of angel and God signify that this is sort of it's a divine being. It's also an emissary, a messenger of the divine. And But what it actually is will be something that you need to figure out through your own working with it. So you say these words to the angel, he will quickly respond to you about whatever you want. But you adjure him with this oath that he meet you and remain inseparable, and that he not keep silent or disobey in any way. And when he has with certainty accepted this oath of yours, take the god by the hand and leap down, and after bringing him into the narrow room where you reside, sit him down. After first preparing the house in a fitting manner and providing all types of foods and Mendesian wine, set these before the god, with an uncorrupted boy serving, and maintaining silence until the angel departs. And you address preliminary words to the god. I shall have you as a friendly assistant, Paradros, a beneficent god who serves me whenever I say, quickly, by your power now appear to me on earth, yea, verily God. And while reclining, you yourself speak about what you propose. Test this oath of the god on what you wish. When 3 hours are past, the god will immediately leap up, order the boy to run to the door, and say, Go, Lord, blessed God, where you live eternally, as you will. And the god vanishes. So in this section here, you see a lot of features that one will see in later grimoire magic. So you have this sort of binding by oath, where you sort of form an agreement. And the part of the spell which I haven't read here is the Paradros gives you a name by which to call it. So there's this long sort of process of conjuration, but then an agreement is set up between the magician and the entity concerned, where the magician gains a name and authority by which he can call the spirits. There is an agreement so that they don't have to go through the whole conjuration process again in the future, which is very common, and particularly if you look at, say, how the true grimoire works, where it's all the pact formed with the spirits so that you can then have a better relationship with them. It's very similar to the system you see here. You also have that standard license to depart at the end. Go, Lord, blessed God, wherever you live eternally, as you will. And so that kind of sort of dismissal at the end is, again, a very standard form of sort of spiritist magic. As for sort of the whole sort of vision that appears, it's unclear whether this vision is meant to be a sort of literal vision you see before your face. The uncorrupted boy might suggest that the boy is meant to be acting as a medium, as was very common to use sort of virgin boys as mediums in this period and in the grimoires as well. But that's not entirely clear from the text. Certainly, the making of a food offering to the spirit is very common. That's a very common thing you see in Paradros spells. But the spell often leaves a lot of things unanswered. But from sort of analysing these spells, the things I was able to certainly say for the Paradros is that it's if one were to have one, it is supposed to give one the power to do all the things a magician should do. And the process for creating this relationship bears a great resemblance to the process we see for creating relationships with spirits in the later grimoire traditions as well. The interesting part of this spell, and the reason why I refer to this as an internalized Paradros, is because at the start of the spell, the Paradros is referred to as an aerial spirit. And at the end of the spell, the magician is referred to as an aerial spirit. And it's talked about how the magician, the Paradros, will bring the soul of the spirit of the magician up to the gods when they die, and the magician will be worshipped as a god in life because of the powers brought to him by the Paradros. And so there's this, through sort of a careful reading of the text, you can see that there is this is not a conjuration where the sort of spirit remains sort of wholly separate, but rather the magician and the Paradros almost become one. They are joined in a deeply intimate way that brings about the deification of the magician himself. This is not something that goes for all Paradroi, but certainly some Paradroi, such as the one in this spell, go beyond simply being an assistant in the magician's practical magic. They become a route for the magician's own apotheosis. They serve a similar role, say, to sort of the Holy Guardian Angel, insofar as they help the magician to progress on their own spiritual journey. And so I could go on about the Paradros for hours. I wrote a whole dissertation on them. They're very, very complex things. But sort of summarize, they are these assistant spirits that in some spells remain wholly separate to the magician. In others, they are become joined to the magician, and so bringing about sort of spiritual advancement for the magician. But their main purpose is to do all those sort of practical measures, practical magical things the magicians are supposed to do, and they become they serve as an explanation almost for the miracles the magician is supposed to be able to work. As for what that means for modern day practitioners, as I said, I do not have my own Paradros yet. This is a working that I've yet to try and reconstruct, but it is on the list for the next couple of years, so perhaps once I've worked it, I'll write some more or talk some more about it then.
Yeah, no, I definitely look forward to hearing what happens when you do it. It's really just interesting to hear you talk about this because um, you mentioned a lot of really good things in all of that, like the tech that translates into the grimoires, for example. You covered, pacts and oaths and protective phylacteries. So all of those are really familiar to people who do grimoire magic. So the other thing I thought that was interesting is that in a way it's similar to the Holy Guardian Angel in function. I guess my next question is, you said that the Paradross is in specific spells. So is it only required to have a Paradross for those spells, or is it just like um, kind of just once you have that, you're ready to go for all spells? Like, is it required to use for all spells? Does that make sense? Like what I'm getting at?
Yeah, it does. And I think so from having worked the PGM, worked the spells that I have worked from the PGM, I do not have a Paradross, but I have successfully worked spells from the PGM. So as a practitioner, I can say no, it is not a something that you have to make these spells work by any stretch of the imagination. I think that if you look at if you read the text a bit deeper and thinking about what the original magicians may have thought, certainly the first Papyrus 1, starts with the first two spells in that papyrus are Paradross spells, which suggests perhaps the magician or scribe copying these thought they were of sort of the first step, but not necessarily. It may have just been the order he happened to copy it down. And the difficulty one has with the PGM is it is very difficult to make sweeping statements about how magic in the PGM is supposed to work, or at least about the theory behind it, because it's not a complete system. It's multiple magicians working notes, and these magicians would have copied spells down from their friends and from people they met. And so one can often find quite different ideas contained within one papyrus. And yes, there are some similar strains of thought that run through, but even the Paradross evolves and changes from sort of spell to spell across multiple different papyri in different time periods. And so some magicians may well have thought that the Paradross was the first thing you had to do, and in the way they worked, it may well have been. But as a magician coming to it today, one has to draw out what they can, extrapolate one's own system. And I think that purely because the Paradross spells are some of the more difficult to reconstruct, just surely because, for example, this one involves having a falcon's head, which is not something I happen to have lying around. I think there are many sort of even practical considerations that suggest that the Paradross may not be the best sort of first spell to start with. So I think that it's certainly an important part of some of the systems of the sort of personal systems of some of those magicians. But I think as a practitioner today, don't worry if you've not got a Paradross, just crack on and do the spells, and I assure you they will work for you. I think it is very much a bit like having knowledge and conversation of your holy guardian angel. It's a nice to have. It's a very good thing to have, but you can certainly work magic without it.
I love that. Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at and what I wanted to hear. So thanks for answering that so transparently, because I think, this is something that's confusing for a lot of people that are just starting out. So yeah, kind of switching gears here, because you covered a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about as far as the Paradross goes. On to some other parts of the PGM. How do you pronounce the Barbarous Words or Voces Magicae, and is it important to get it correct?
So I have really mixed feelings about this. So on the one hand, there are, and forgive me, I can't remember the reference, there is one spell in the papyri that I know of that actually gives you instructions on how to pronounce it. So clearly, to some of these magicians, the pronunciation was very important. I have found that I've pronounced them in the way that makes sense to me when using them, and it's worked. It might have worked better if I tried to copy sort of the dialects that would have been used, for example, Koine Greek. I'm always sort of skeptical about how important pronunciation must be, because in the history of sort of Western magic, there's an awful lot of bad pronunciation. I mean, if you look at the Hebrew in, say, the Golden Dawn system, which is pronounced horribly, mean, the magic still works. And I think that with Greek, it's certainly easier to we have a better idea of how it may have been pronounced because of the sort of the system in Greek of how there's lots of accents and breathings and so on, which can give one a relatively good idea of how it may have been pronounced. And there's a lot of research that's been done in sort of different Greek dialects and their influence in literature. I have to say it's not an area that particularly interests me, and I think that comes from my background in Latin, insofar as pretty much all Latin students and Latin teachers I now am would say fairly early on, dead language, doesn't really matter how you pronounce it, we're doing this as a written thing. Obviously, and so I think my attitude from that has certainly bled over into my use of the Greek papyri. I think certainly from my own experience so far, and I'm willing to have my mind changed on this, but so far from my own experience, I would suggest that if one can get comfortable saying the words and can say them in a way that it's clear to you what you're trying to say, and that it's not sort of doesn't come out kind of garbled and weird, that you are consistent in the way you pronounce the Voces Magicae within a specific spell, then I think you will have good results. I think that if the spirits were put off by bad pronunciation, then the human history of spirit concepts would be very short indeed, just because of how badly magicians will have pronounced this stuff over the years. And and so many of these sort of Voces Magicae anyway are sort of bastardized forms of god names where someone's misheard something and then written it down. I think make sure when you are about to practice these spells, I would say if you're going to rehearse any of it beforehand, rehearse the saying of the Voces Magicae so that you're comfortable saying them and you don't trip over them and it sounds, you can pronounce them clearly. Don't worry too much about whether you are pronouncing it exactly how a Greco-Egyptian magician would have done at the time, because there would have been lots of people doing this with various different accents. And you can spend many a fruitful afternoon studying ancient dialects of Greek, and it's great fun, but it's not practicing magic. So I think you have to get to a point of where I want to do this work, so I need to have some sort of pronunciation. So I would just go with pronouncing it as best you can in a way that is clear and makes sense to you, and then let results indicate how successful that was.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and that's actually what I've been doing, but it's really good advice, so thanks for clarifying that. So another thing that I come across in the PGM a lot, and I've even had friends ask me about, is what does the usual mean?
The usual, yes, you'll see that in a lot of spells. They'll say, do the usual at the end. And the honest answer is we've no idea. I mean, as I said, these are the written notes of a working magician, so the usual will have been whatever that magician happened to do how their personal system works. And just as I'm sure we all do, we have our own personal practices. When I write my own spells and rituals down that I'm doing, I don't put everything in because I know in my head what to put in where. And it's exactly the same here. And so do the usual will mean, I don't know, it could mean the way they set up their space. It could mean a prayer that they always say there. It could mean a way they flap their arms about a particular moment. Who knows? It really could mean anything. So what you have to do when faced... I've seen various magicians, such as Sam Block, whose work is fantastic. If you want to learn more about PGM, do check his work out. He provides various sort of rituals which he suggests might work for the bit where they say do the usual. But ultimately, what you have to do there is it's up to you. You need to. This is the work of the big part of working with the PGM is that it is an act of reconstruction, and more than reconstruction, it's an act of adaptation, because you're taking things that were designed for use at a particular time and sort of the notes about them, and you're trying to extrapolate your own system from that. So where it says do the usual, you need to figure out what you would do there, what makes sense to you from your own understanding of magic. What would you do there? And of course, that's going to change. And I wouldn't get too hung up on, is it the right thing? Because it won't be the same thing as the ancient magicians did. That's okay, because probably multiple magicians may have used these spells, and they probably wouldn't have done the same thing when it said do the usual either. So it's the magic of the Greek Magical Papyri it's very hybrid. It's very creative. You've got lots of different people coming together to create these spells that show influences from all over. And I think the worst thing you can do when working with these papyri is trying to treat them as some sort of gospel that you have to follow to the letter, because they were never intended that way. These magicians were incredibly creative people developing these sort of new sort of ways of doing magic. And if you're going to work with them, you need to enter into that spirit yourself. You need to try and figure out how to make them usable, how you're going to draw from this. So when it comes to do the usual, that's sort of over to you. That's all right. Sort of like, we're taking the stabilizers off now. You need to figure that bit out for yourself. So, I mean, I couldn't, if you point to a specific spell, I might be able to suggest what I might do there. That's only what I might do. I can't give you a definite answer on what do the usual is, because there isn't one.
I love it. Honestly, I think that it just gives people permission to be creative and figure out what the usual is. And honestly, yeah, that's, I think, what I would like to do myself and see other people do. So yeah, it is a little confusing though. So I guess with that said, are there any other other confusing or unhelpful things that we might come across in the PGM?
Confusing or unhelpful things. I mean, I suppose it depends on what you consider confusing or unhelpful. I mean, so for example, there's the classic one of the ingredients. So a lot of the ingredients aren't actually what it says. So if it says crocodile dung, that probably means something else, for example. And there's helpfully, there's a list in the papyri of sort of the code for various ingredients. So it'll say crocodile dung is, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I think it's a plant of some description. And so you have this list of saying, I don't know, bill of an ibis, it actually means this plant. A bit like how eye of newt, tongue of dog from Shakespeare, those are all actually folk names for specific plants. And it's a similar idea one finds with the ingredients in the PGM. So that can be something that someone might find quite off-putting. You might look at it and go, well, I've not got any crocodile dung. How am I going to get that? And it's like, well, don't risk your life. It might actually be a plant. So then you can do some research and find out if it's something you can actually get without risking getting eaten. But it's so that's one sort of potential issue. I mean, people talk a lot about sort of blinds in the grimoires and sort of and this idea that they would put things in to deliberately fool you. I mean, the ingredients thing might be considered an example of one of those. But I don't have too much truck with that. I mean, it might just be because I'm not of sufficient spiritual whatever to see through the blind. But as far as but I have yet to see anything where I go, well, that's obviously designed to hide something from something else beyond the sort of ingredient thing. Other things that sort of might be confusing or challenging, I think one of the things that people often get confused, particularly if they're coming from sort of a neo-pagan background, is the relationship with the gods. And the way the gods work in these papyri, or the way the gods are worked with, they're not treated a lot of the time the way one might expect the Olympian and Egyptian gods to be treated. A lot of the time they're treated more like sort of tricksy spirits and demons. And this can alarm some modern practitioners. And I think that when working, I think these texts will challenge one's sort of perspectives of the divine and how you understand them. And I think that's a very valuable process. I think it can break us out of sort of a very sort of a whitewashed thinking of the gods, sort of these perfect beings, and sort of all separate entities living together in harmony. And actually, you get a better idea of sort of the much messier, less well-defined view of the divine that was more common amongst sort of the magical practitioners and indeed just sort of general sort of polytheists in the ancient world. Because the other thing you see is all the gods being sort of syncretized, well, syncretism. The different gods get combined to create new gods, and it's and you'll see various sort of gods referred to by the names of other gods and so on, which all suggests that the perspectives of who these divinities are very, very fluid. And the sort of the good sides of the gods and the bad sides are equally embraced. For example, in the prayer to Selene for any spell, which is my favourite invocation of Hecate, it makes a lot of her sort of the cosmic world soul and the goddess of nature, but it also sort of describes her as sort of horrific demon with sort of a scaly wound and sort of all sorts of clanking chains and all sorts of things. And she's syncretized with the goddess of the moon, but also with the Furies. And I think what these texts really do beautifully is they recognize the fact that the divine is not something that humans can adequately describe. We cannot put it into boxes. It defies all expectation or all attempts to do so. So I think when working with these spells, if you see a description or an entity of a divinity that doesn't jive with you, that's not how you've perceived that divinity before, or it seems wrong because they've mixed it with that divinity, my advice would be go with it, because gods are way bigger than we think they are, or even if we intellectually know they are, then it still goes beyond even that. So so I think that being open to have your views of who the gods are and how magic with them should work, be open to have those challenged and changed, is another area that I can see sort of causing difficulties for people, but I think actually is really, really exciting, an important part of one's spiritual growth.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in fact, it's definitely been a learning process for me, because my perspective has changed so frequently. So that is also really good advice. My next question for you is, are there any like obscure things in the PGM that you would like to see people experiment with more?
Love it, because it's brilliant, and everyone should do it. It's amazing. I love it. I think that what I would like to see is more and more people developing their practices out of the PGM and saying that that's what they've done. I see the PGM everywhere. So many magicians who write about sort of grimoire magic and that kind of thing. I see so much stuff that's come out of the PGM in there, and I would love it if those people who do that would say that it came from the PGM, just because it will then, for those who are sort of worrying that the PGM might be difficult or sort of obscure, will see, actually, no, this is how magicians are using it today. And I think that'd be really, really valuable for people who want to start working with them. I think that the really exciting thing about the PGM is that it provides all the makings for a system of spirit-based magic that is purely pagan. So if one is uncomfortable with the sort of the Christian trappings of the grimoires, as many pagan magicians are, PGM is a goldmine, because the systems there are fully fledged systems of conjuration in there. There are systems you can use to create talismans and spells for pretty much anything you can think of. I think that if you're looking to sort of develop a sort of system of pagan spirit-based magic in your personal practice, then the PGM is the place to go. So I'm quite excited about. I've seen Matt Hadfield recently published an excellent pamphlet for Hadean Press called, I believe, A Wondrous Spell, which talks about one of the necromantic spells within the PGM. And he's very much he advocates sort of similar things I do about that, the creativity, the sort of trying to take a creative approach and develop one's own practice from it. And I think a lot of this, I was really excited by this, because this particular spell is one of the ones that many people would not touch with a barge pole, because it is so unpleasant. As it is, the aim of the spell is to basically turn a woman into a sex object through the use of conjuring up sort of a restless dead spirit and making them basically drag this woman to you kicking and screaming, which is horrible, and not something anyone should do. But there's, within that spell, there's actually a lot of really interesting tech which one could draw out and use for hopefully less awful purposes. And so I think that for people doing more work like that and looking at some of the dark and more unsavory stuff and sort of like scraping the dark fluff off and going, actually, what useful tech is in here, I think could be really interesting. So I'm hoping Matt's going to put more out there, because I think his work is fabulous. And I think if you're interested in sort of ancient necromancy and ancient approaches like that, you should read his work. So yeah, I think we're at a really interesting time where there are more and more people talking and writing about the PGM, such as Matt, such as Jack Grail, such as Jake Stratton-Kent, amongst many others. Alison Tchaikovsky is someone else whose work on PGM is absolutely brilliant. I think with more people like this producing sort of PGM-based work, I just hope that some of this amazing sort of magic that's in there get to see the light of day again, and we'll have a new sort of generation of pagan magicians practicing authentic spirit-based magic. That may be a golden dream. I don't know, but I think there's certainly sort of promising, looking promising so far. So that's what I hope will come out of the PGM.
I totally agree. And you mentioned a lot of really good names there. So shout out to Matt, because I wrote a blog on Matt's pamphlet. That was exactly why I loved it, because it was a really good example of somebody experimenting with the PGM and looking deeper into the spell's meaning. So yeah, definitely amazing. And Jack, again, Jake Stratton-Kent, Allison, all amazing work. So I will definitely put links to anything relevant, just because I think these are all things that are helpful for magicians who are wanting to experiment. So yeah, speaking of experiments, you wrote an article on statue ensoulment. So can you kind of talk about statue installment and like what that process was like for you, and just tell me more about it?
Sure. So this was my exciting lockdown project. This came about because I was missing various elements of group work that I'm used to in my Wiccan tradition, and I wanted to try and have similar experiences of the sort of embodied divine as I might have been used to. I wanted to be able to have a more intense experience of the divine in my own practice, in order to make up for the fact that I wasn't having sort of the wonderful things that come about in Wiccan ritual on a regular basis. So I decided that I wanted to create ensouled statues. Ensouled statue is basically a magical, is an idol. It's a magical idol, a statue that is imbued with the spirit of the divinity concerned. And there are various theories about how that might work. So quite a Neoplatonic theory that one finds in the Greek Magical Papyri as well is this idea that a daimon of the god, so God sends sort of a daimon to represent them, to live in this statue and sort of take your messages basically set up a communication between you and the divinity. I didn't subscribe so much to that theology. I just went for conjuring the god straight out into the statue. The results that I've had from that work have been that it's the actual act of sort of creating the statue was very, very powerful one. I experienced the presence of the gods in a very, very tangible, very intense way that I don't want to talk too much about, but it blew my mind. And it was one of those moments where you go, whoa, this shit fucking works. Excuse my French. We all have those wonderful moments in magic where it really hits all the buttons and blows the fuse board, and this was one of them. The way I went about this was I went to the PGM because I knew that because magical statues are a mainstay of sort of the magical practice in the PGM. There's several spells for creating them. And what I did was I read through the various statue spells, and I identified some of the key areas that I thought might be that sort of repeated. I extracted the technology. So the things that I found were sort of writing names of power on the papyri, iris, and putting it under the statue, making sacrifices to the statue, writing petitions on the statue, making the statue from materials linked to the deity. Then, interestingly enough, strangling sacrifice, usually birds, give breath to the statue, like the breath of life. I looked at this and went, right, I need to want to sort of adapt from this, because I'm not working a PGM spell. I'm taking PGM tech and using it in a different tradition. What I did was I went for, rather than the sacrifice, I went for other traditional offerings to the deities concerned. And instead of the strangling the birds to give breath of life to the statue, because feelings on animal sacrifice are very much, if you're part of a tradition that knows how to do it, say Voodoo or Santeria, then fine. That's wonderful. That's really good. I think if you're someone coming at this from a tradition that does not make use of animal sacrifice, I think risk becomes that you are doing this simply because it's sort of like edgy or useful magic and you're killing something for absolutely no reason. I think if you can find ways around it, then you should. And I certainly am not comfortable with strangling an animal because that's just cruel. I instead opted for sort of the more sort of like Jewish approaches sort of from the Bible of sort of breathing the breath of life into the statue myself. And that tracks because sort of the Jewish influence on the magic in the papyri is huge. There's a huge Jewish influence on them. So that was well sort of within keeping with the system I was working in. Also, I didn't have statues were pre-made. I'm not a sculptor by any stretch of the imagination, so I was working with pre-made statues. So I couldn't ensure they were made out of materials suitable to the divinity. But there was a workaround, which I found in the PGMs. There's one spell where you create a statue of Selene, the moon goddess, and she's anointed. The statue is anointed with a lunar ointment. So what I did was I created an ointment or an oil that was made out of ingredients that were sort of sacred to the divinity I was working with. And then I anointed the statue with that oil in order to create that link and align the physical material of the statue with the deity concerned. And so I then sort of wrote out a ritual process, which I detail in this article, where I began with sort of a preliminary set your ritual space up in the way one normally sets up their ritual space, however you happen to do that. Then I invoke the deity in question and ask for their sort of blessings over over the ritual and sort of look favourably upon it. Then prepare the statue itself by creating it with sort of fire and water, and making sort of it, preparing it sort of as a blank slate for the divinities to come into, and then anointing it with the oil. And in doing so, I also anointed myself with the oil in order to give myself a connection to that divinity and assume some of the divinity's own power in order to then have the authority to invoke them, and also to strengthen that connection so that I could better perceive them in the ritual. Then opened the mouth and eyes of the statue, is sort of the standard Egyptian idea of opening the mouth, in order that it might receive my offerings and communicate with me. And then I did a breathing, a bit of breath work where I generated energy within myself using my breath, which I then breathed into the statue in order to enliven it. And once the statue was enlivened, then saw the statue as a living being, and then I invoked the spirit of the deity into that statue. So the statue actually in my ritual becomes alive before the divinity enters into it, because my thinking was that the gods, the living beings are the embodiment of the divine. So to make a statue living seemed the logical step before then inviting the divinity to live within it. And then I invited the divinity in, and declared that the statue was divinity, and then made offerings, and then sat in meditation with it. And it was an incredibly tense experience, and in which I felt that certain sort of mysteries were revealed to me in sort of that way that happens through ritual. It sounds awfully pompous. Mysteries revealed to me, as I mean, my own sort of understanding of of the divinity developed slightly. And then since then, these statues have now become a sort of a mainstay of my practice, and they serve as my link to those gods. I don't think the gods reside in them always, or certainly not with that intensity. It would be quite difficult if they did. But they are my link. They are in my daily prayers. They form a central role in that. And when I make offerings to these deities, I use these statues as sort of a point of contact. Interestingly enough, I've had. In ritual, when I work ritual with these deities on my own, I will vote into the statues again. And other times I have had the divinities just of their own accord just manifest through the statue because that's what they wanted to do, usually during my prayers. So it's like having the statues. I always treat the statues as living. I always treat them with respect because they house the divinity as and when the divinity wishes to use them. The divinity will turn up as and when they wish to. But even when the divinity is not there, they're always connected to it, and they are sort of a living sort of familiar is the wrong word, but sort of a living entity with which I work. It's a practice that I would highly recommend. If you're interested in how to do it, then please do check out my article. And it is the system is based in the PGM, but it is not a PGM spell. It is rather it's tech that I've drawn from there. I think that also kind of summarizes very much how I work with the PGM. I tend to take sort of tech out. I do adapt some of the spells straight out. A lot of the time it's a matter of sort of extracting tech and using them for my own purposes, because that ultimately is what the magicians would have done. That's how these spells came about. They came about by magicians sort of fiddling with bits and pieces and taking tech from here and there and creating a new spell. That's how all spells are created. And so it was a very, very fruitful experience for me. And it was, if I was to point to any sort of PGM style working that I've done that I thought was amazing, I'd say that was the one that really, for me, and I'm sort of set the standard that I now expect for my workings with the PGM. So statue ensoulment, it's the process of creating a divinely ensouled statue that has a divinity resident within it, or at least it creates a residence which the divinity may reside in at any time as it wishes. And it allows one to have very intense sort of theophanies, intense experiences of these divinities, and forms a link both for magical purposes and also for sort of acts of devotion.
Yeah, so that is actually perfect because that is exactly what I noticed when I read your article is that you essentially took the tech and used it for other purposes. And it's really just, I think, important for people to see what options are available to them, what they can do, what they can experiment with. And it's something I'm looking forward to doing myself. So thank you for sharing that. I'm definitely going to
You're
put a link
welcome.
below. So aside from that experiment and like the Paradros one, are there any other like things that you're doing right now with the PGM that you want to talk about or share?
So what am I doing at the moment? I'm working with continuing to work with the for any spell as part of my regular Hecate practice. I'm starting to work with the Stele of Dew. I'm trying to at the moment is figure out a sort of a framing ritual of my own for PGM things. I've tried various different sort of ritual structures with PGM things, and I'm trying to still sort of figure out exactly how I like to do it. I'm trying to figure out what my usual is, which I'm sure, and I know that's going to be an evolving, changing process, and I will probably settle on one, use it a few times, then decide I like something different, but that's just me. It's, it's one of the things that I'm really quite excited about is BJ Swain's new book, The Luminarium, which has a fantastic system of conjuration in it that is one of those ones where I could see the influence from the PGM in there. I think the bit where conjuration of the lamp that he gives is directly taken from the PGM. And that's designed for conjuring sort of the planetary angels in sort of a Solomonic system using the Solomonic pentacles, as I know you know. And I'm looking, my next sort of project that I'm setting myself is to work that system on its own terms, and then try and see if I can make it work for some of the conjurations in the PGM, because I think that from looking at it, it looks like it would work really nicely as a sort of solitary ritual process for the various conjuration spells in the PGM. There's a conjuration of Anubis, for example, which I think would work really beautifully with the ancestor stuff in there. That's a project which I want to start on, which is exciting. But yeah, it's been an interesting year. I've had in my own sort of work and professional life, I've unfortunately not had much time to do as much ritual magic as I would like. So at the moment, I've been looking at building a sort of my personal practice and my relationships with these deities, and using various sort of prayers from the PGM and the Orphic hymns and so on to keep my sort of foot in the door with these entities, as it were, to lay the way for some sort of ritual work which I'm planning. So hopefully many exciting things to come involving talking to lots of spirits and lots of fun spells, and I'll let you know how that goes.
Well, I look forward to it because I will be doing similar experiments. So, yeah, so that is really cool. So, honestly, today has just been so insightful, and I'm really excited to share this with everybody because I think that they will find so much value in the conversation that we had. So, where can people find you? Where's the best place for them to follow up?
The best place to find me would be on my blog, which is called Cross Country Witchcraft, which I run with my friend Kim Dean. And I post about a number of different things, including my work with PGM. So if you're interested in sort of what I'm doing magically, what's on my mind at the moment, that's the place to go. And I'm also on Twitter as Tom McArthur. You can find me on there, and that's I post intelligent things about magic there. I also post a lot of just sort of shit posting as well. But the Twitter is, if you want to talk to me, Twitter's the best way, and you'll find a lot of my work and my articles on my blog, Cross Country Witchcraft.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. It has truly been a pleasure. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.